Tonight I am going to be assembling some C key, Commodore key keyboard adapters. Um, and so I'm going to walk folks through the process in case you've bought a kit and you're looking to put a unit together yourself. I've got two units here that I'm going to be putting together tonight. One is a Commodore 64 configuration, and the other one is a Commodore 128 configuration. So I'll show you what parts are the same and what's different with each one.
Morning.
So the unit itself has this board right here. It's always the same board for all the configurations. And there are parts that are the same for all of the units. And so we'll go ahead and put those together. I've got my microscope set up right here. I will turn on my soldering iron so we can start the working here. So one of the things that I prefer to do to make these as easy as possible to put together is to install parts based on the height off the board. Makes it easier to solder them up. So the parts that are the light, the least tall or the shortest, I guess you could say, are these resistors and the diodes, and so at least some of the resistors. And so I'm going to put a couple of the resistors on both of the boards.
Go for Retro is now live.
So this is
Streaming. C = key assembly.
this is a 10K. You can see here brown, black, orange, and 10K is a resistor. It's needed. Let me make sure that I've got it over here so everybody can see it. So essentially, we have to pull the legs down like so. So we can install it over here. This goes to the reset line on the AVR microcontroller that's on the board. And so we'll put that on there, and then I'm going to get the other board here and do the same thing. So I have a 10K resistor for it as well. There we go. 10K resistor on here, same place. Got those on there. And then the other part, it typically is the shortest or least tall on the board, is the diode. There's two diodes on the design. We're only going to be we'll populate one for each of these designs because the design is, for one of them is, both of them are Commodore keyboards I'm sorry, PC keyboards to Commodore endpoints. And so in that case, you only need to put one of the diodes in. The diodes are because it's a possibility that the board can be installed in the computer as well as be connected to a PC at the same time. So we're going to install one diode in here, and I'll put it in here so you can see real quick. Let me get the, there we go. So you can see on this unit right here, the diode has a it has a direction. There's a little silver band around it, and you can see on the board there is, let's see if I can get it right there. There's a white stripe on the diode. So we're going to go ahead and put the other diode in as well. And then when we get these in, we've got one more. We have one more resistor we need to put together. So we'll put this resistor, or put this diode in. Again, make sure that you put the diode with the correct direction or polarity, or else it won't. It simply will not function. So the other resistor we're going to put on is a 330K resistor. I'll put it under the microscope here so folks can see it. Let me bring, let's see, there we go. So this one is, it's hard to see on the thing, but it is orange brown, which is 330 ohms. This is for the LED, and so it goes right here. Let me bring the thing over here, right there, 330 ohms. Go ahead and put it in there. Sometimes you have to kind of wiggle them around to get them. And of course, on what I do is I bend the pins out when they get through to the other side. Then we'll put the same um, resistor in the other board. There we go. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so now we can start soldering. So the nice thing about this is the boards will lay flat on your workspace. So you can go ahead and put um, solder on these connections. Um, Everybody has their own favorite way to solder. I'm not going to teach people how to solder. I figure you either know or you don't. Let's see. I think that's it on that board. Diode pins are thicker than the others, so it takes a little bit more heat to get them put into place. There we go. So now some people keep all these little pieces. Free to do that if you want. They come in handy. I build enough stuff that I end up with hundreds of these things, so I don't tend to keep them all, but your mileage may vary. So, but I would recommend cutting them off as close to the board as possible. Okay, so the next thing that's from a height perspective are the capacitors. In the ceramic capacitors, I'll put them underneath the, um, so here is, there should be two loose capacitors, and they'll say 10, you can't see that, let me, that's a little hard to see, but these say 104, which is a zero point 0.1 microfarad bypass capacitor. And there are two spots on the board for those. One is right here where it says 0.1 UF, right there. So we'll put one in there. And then the other one is down here. We'll put it down here. And then bend the leads out on the top here so that everything looks good. Do the same thing with the other. Now these capacitors, these 0.1 UF capacitors, they will come individual in the kit, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so there's our capacitors. Then we have some other capacitors, and they are shipped in the kit as a pair of two. And these are capacitors to trim out the crystal that's used for the microcontroller. These are, they, depending on how old your kit is, they could be 18 or 22 picofarad capacitors. They'll have a 22 on them or an 18. on them. I think these are 18s. They have to be around 16 to 22 or 24 picofarad for the crystal. There's some calculations used to figure that out, but the key is that they have they're much smaller in capacitance than the zero point 0.1 microfarad capacitors that are the bypass capacitors, and so you you need to um, you need to be aware of which capacitors are going in which location. So that takes care of that board. I got another batch of them over here. I take a little bit of effort to get out of the little, it's a tape is what they call it. That's how you can buy the capacitors. Whoops, you can buy the capacitors in a big long um, reel of that tape. Um, that's how they machine assemble using these capacitors. So, okay, so that's, you can see how I've done that. I'll go ahead and solder these up. Okay, there's two capacitors right there on that board. And then two more capacitors on this board. I gotta get these other two capacitors. So we'll go ahead and solder them up. Obviously, it may take, if you're new to soldering, it may take you longer to solder things up. That's okay. Just make sure you're using a reasonable solder pencil as opposed to a soldering iron like you use for electrical work, heavy duty electrical work. Those soldering irons have way too much power for electronics projects like this. If you're not careful, it'll damage pretty much everything on the board. Again, cleaning up the boards. I'd hold on to the little leads when you snip them off because they'll go flying and you'll find them, you'll get your foot or some other part of your body stuck in them at some point if you're not careful. Okay, the next thing that's tall, or the next taller item on the board is the crystal. So, and I'll put it under here so everybody can see. This is a 14 megahertz crystal, 14.7456, I believe. Anyway, there's a spot right on the board for it, right next to those two 18 picofarad capacitors. So that's not a big deal. And right here. So you'll see it's right there. Tell you what, I'm going to make this a little bit brighter so folks can see it here. Yeah, that should help a little bit. Okay. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So again, slip it through. It has no direction. Resistors, capacitors, and crystals have no directionality, so you don't have to worry about them, just the diode. We'll go ahead and solder this up. There we go. One. And
I have two of them, assembled, in that box over there dash.
cool. Okay, now the next tallest thing on the board is going to be the sockets. So on units that are a PS2 keyboard to a Commodore computer, you're going to have two of these big 40-pin sockets that you need to install. One for the microcontroller itself, which goes in this bottom slot right here, and then one in this top upper slot, which is for the cross-point switch. Now, what I often do is take a small screwdriver and bend over one of the pins on each on two of the corners. It just saves you some trouble of having to fight um, with the sockets all the time. So there's one of the units with its sockets. Now make sure on the sockets, you'll see here there is a, let me see if I can get it in focus here. Right there you see there's a indent, and that signifies pin 1. Pin 1 is right here. And so you want to make sure the sockets um, have that little indention on the side where the legend that's you can see down below there on the silk screen. It shows the the little indent in the IC. That'll help you. It's not absolutely required. If you put one in backwards, it's not the end of the world. But you just got to remember that um, the the CPU or the microcontroller and the cross-point switch have to go with their little indent pointing to the left as you're looking at the text right side up. So that's that board. We'll get it put over to the side here, and we will put these, both of these units are PS2 keyboard to Commodore computer units, so they'll both need both chips. If you have a Commodore keyboard to PS2, which is the other way this board can be configured, then you do not need the cross-point switch. It's not necessary for operation of the board. So something to consider. Most of the time, though, folks buy these units to go bidirectional, in which case both chips are required, or they buy in the direction of putting a PS2 keyboard on their Commodore, in which case both chips are required. So we've got those. Now here's where one thing differs between the two units. I'm going to get rid of these extra things here. Let me clean these up just a little bit. So in this case, one of these units is a C128 unit, and a C128 unit, in the case of going both directions, I'm sorry, you need to scan a C128 keyboard. You need this additional chip that's right here, 74 LS1 245, right there. I just realized this is only one direction. I normally install them, so I'm going to leave that off. So I guess but that's something where there's a difference between 128 and 64 mode. This is to scan the extra keys on the Commodore 128 keyboard. If you're doing 128 keyboard to PC, you need that chip installed, and you need to have the socket for it put there. So let's see what's next. So let's go ahead and solder up these sockets. This is kind of tedious. So I don't know what to tell you other than it's tedious, and you gotta work your way through it. Obviously, I've done these quite a bit, so kind of go through them real quick here. Make sure you put enough solder on, but don't try to, don't put too much on, obviously, but um, uh, the design is pretty forgiving. So if this is an early uh, do-it-yourself build, it's it's pretty easy to um, go ahead and do this. But if you end up with the big thing to stay away from is um, if you have too much solder. I'll put a situation like right here. Let's see, there's too much solder on there, and you end up with a solder bridge, and that is a bad deal, and you don't want that. What I would recommend is that you can get a solder sucker, or I use solder braid. There you go, to clean that up. Obviously, it was a self-inflicted wound, but okay. Couple more of these to go. And this is worst case scenario because you got to do 80 of these. You'll notice the pads are different. Um, these are oval pads, I guess. The other ones are round. There's no, these have better, um, I would say they have more, because they have more surface area. Um, they make more of a mechanical connection, but they also take up more room on the board. So I typically don't um, design boards with rectangular, or sorry, oval connectors like this, or pads like this anymore. I just use the round ones like those right there. But I think a lot of the default footprints that come with various projects um, are these ovals, which is fine. Now, if you're soldering up that uh, the socket for that 74 LS 245, it's a good idea to install it before you get started on soldering these sockets, because the solder may pull over into here and it's then harder to put the socket in otherwise. So there's one. We'll do this other one here. Take care of. This is probably the most tedious part. Okay. Quarter of the way done. And halfway done on this. These round pads also take less solder, so they go faster. Okay, a few more and then we'll be done with this part. There we go. Okay. So getting there. So we have um, another item, which is probably the next tallest item, is this one other resistor. The reason it's taller is we can't lay it completely down. So this is a 100K resistor. It's used to help us figure out whether the board is being powered from the computer or it's being powered from the PS2 connection. It goes in a small, let's see, I'll put it over here in the thing. So it's right here. It says it right by the LED. It says 100K. It's right there. It's also got no direction, so you can install it any way you want. I tend to put the the part that's the LED part over here, and you notice this to be bent so that the LED is standing straight up. Um, if I was designing the board now, I wouldn't do that, but um, this was one of the very first designs I made back in I think 2004, 2005, somewhere in that time frame. So I was learning how the PS2 um, protocol worked, and I wanted a better keyboard for my C64. So that was the plan. So I designed this board, and it's got some definite use. I'll probably, at some point, I do want to redesign it because it can be made a whole lot smaller, but I didn't know that at the time. Okay, so there is the last resistor. Now, mind you, if you do like a 64SX or a 128D, the 330 ohm resistor that we talked about earlier may not be in your kit, and it's not required. It's used for the LED, which is SX and um, or the 128D for sure. It doesn't have an LED on the keyboard, and the unit's external. So the next thing that we take care of is on one of these units, which is a 64 unit, we're going to install the connector for the C64's keyboard. Let me find, there we go. So this is the tricky part. You'll get a header in the kit that looks like this. This is what the header looks like. And somehow you need to modify it so that it looks like this, namely that the pin number 2 is gone. The reason is the keyboard on the 64 has a keyed connector with pin 2 is something stuffed in it. And so if you don't take that out, then your keyboard won't fit on there. So I put this on there and turn it upside down. Notice that it goes on connector 5. So you can put it right there on connector 5. And we will turn it over. Obviously, we gotta make sure it doesn't fall out. Now, 128 units will not have that connector. So now I usually solder one of these up, just usually in the middle. So I'll solder one of these in the middle. Let me get there we go. So solder one in the middle, and then I will look and see whether I've gotten it um, straight up and down. If I haven't, then you can move it around by heating that one solder joint up. I would do that before soldering them all together, or otherwise it's not the end of the world, but you'll end up with a crooked connector. So it's best to check it real quick. You probably should do the same thing for the IC sockets as well. I didn't because I was pretty sure that they were all firmly, you know, down on the board, but I've I have in the past put sockets on where I forget to make sure they're flat on the board, and when you get done, they're um, part of the socket is lifted off the board. It's not the end of the world, but it makes for not as clean of a board. So then the other piece for this is a 64. The other piece is the part that's going to plug in to the keyboard connector on the C64 or VIC-20. This works on the VIC-20 as well. That has to be mounted underneath on that C4. Let's see if I can bring it over here. There, C4. So we'll go underneath here and we will put it on there. And again, um, we'll do the same thing. We'll solder one of the connectors or one of the pins, and then we'll look underneath. And as you can tell, it is very crooked, which is, it's okay right at the moment, but I'll have to fix that. There we go. Now it's not. So we can go ahead and solder the rest of these up. Such a small board, this has quite a bit of pads to solder. So that's unfortunate. And okay, so there's that. So that takes care of that. Now the other board is a 128 board and it does not require those connectors, but what it does require is, and if you're doing a 128D setup, you will need this um, DB25 female connector. If you're doing a 128, you don't have to have it. I recommend putting it on because then you can um, put a connector on here, and then the unit can be separated from the 128 if you want um, to remove it later on. But in any case, we need if you're going to solder this DB25 on, again, you want to, these are the stress reliefs. You want to solder them to the board, make sure they're there. Take a good look and make sure you got the connector on the board, and then solder it up. Boom, boom, boom. Um, Oops. And I made a mistake. I just realized I had a couple more header pins I need to put on, and they're actually a little bit less tall than this connector. So I guess do as I say, not as I do. If there's a bunch of jumpers that need to be installed on the unit, and I would recommend installing them on the unit before I install this connector, but I got a little ahead of myself. But we'll go fix that up. So that's that connector. And then we've got these um, these jumpers. There's a jumper here. There's a jumper here. There's a jumper here. There's a jumper here. There's a connector here, and there's an LED connector there, and they all need to have header pins put on them. You'll probably get just a single row of 40 header pins, and so you can just take some pair of scissors or diagonal cutters like this and cut them however you want. There's one, two, one, two, three, four threes, and a four. On an older board, there was also a three right here for the joysticks, but that's been removed in the newest design. There was no, that was an early idea to allow the joysticks to be controlled like um, keyboard keys, but I never did implement it that way. Or, I mean, I implemented it that way, but I never use it that way, so it didn't seem like it was necessary. Okay, so there we go. We got two sets. On these units, since they're only going to be used to connect a PS2 keyboard to the Commodore units, then you don't need this four position one over here. So actually, I can take those and put them off to the side. But if you install it, it's no big deal. So these are a little bit tricky. Um, like I said, if you don't have this connector, then you can turn the board over and solder them up. But I was, like I said, I got a little bit ahead of myself, and so um, caused myself a little bit of grief there. But okay. You can hold them in place and solder them. Again, I would do the same thing for these. I would solder them up um, with one pin and then make sure that they're done correctly. And then solder them up the rest of the way. Well, that's not too bad. This one needs to be moved over just a little bit. Here we go. Cool. You probably won't get them that perfect the first time you do it, but that's okay. This is probably I don't know, I probably made a couple hundred of these, so you get good at it after a while. Okay, and then we've got this last one over here. Oh, solder. Okay. Again, if I was designing this board again, I'd put these jumpers somewhere else. They were easier to solder and easier to put together and not have to be all these different ones. I'd put them all in a row, but I was new at this game when I built this board, so. Okay, so there's those. There's these. And, oops. Okay. Okay, so I got one down. The other one should be easier because I don't have that big, huge connector to deal with. So 1, 2, 3, 4. here. Lost one of them. That's okay. There's one, there's two, there's three. Pretty good. This one on. Good. Could be a little bit better. There we go. All right. Solder the rest of these up. 1, 2, 3, 4. And got this one is, I believe, not absolutely necessary, but we'll put it in anyway. If it's not installed, people are like, well, am I supposed to set that one to? So we'll just go ahead and put it in there, and then it's mainly to move some pins around for a 128, which this board is a 64 board. So choose to install or not. In fact, it's been so long I've forgotten exactly what this pin does, or this jumper does. I think it depends on SX versus 128. Okay, so there is the unit with the exception of one component, which would be this DIN 6 for the mini DIN 6 for the PS2 keyboard. And that goes right here in this corner, and it is the tallest component on the board, so I always put it on last. Easy to solder up, and usually it kind of sticks in there, so you don't have to worry about it. Be careful though when you put it in that sometimes it wants to slide out partway or whatnot, so you want to make sure that.
Oh, smiley face.
There we go.
Building stuff tonight, sir? Laughing face.
Indeed. C keys. Okay, there's one. And here is the second one. Make sure you solder the stress reliefs. There's a lot of pressure on those PS2 keyboard connectors, so I prefer through-hole connectors for stuff like this because there's so much. They make surface mount options, but there's just so much torque on there. Okay. So there's a 64 version and a 128 version. I'll put them right here so you can see there's just a slight difference. And then I've got one thing I need to check on here. Okay, so the 128 one, somebody's ordered it with joyport sockets, which is not a big deal. There's just some more of these little units over here, so we'll go ahead and put them on. Pretty self-explanatory.
What about a Coco version? Laughing face.
You could definitely do that. I have a version of this board that I kind of uh, rigged up to do serial to Coco, so it's definitely possible. I could put a PS2 connector on it There's already a commercial product that somebody sells that is a PS2 connector or a PS2 to Coco. So not sure that there's a need for another one. USB might be nice, but um, that's a big lift to get to USB for keyboard. It's unfortunate because keyboards are such simple devices. It would be easier to put, I mean, it'd be nice to be able to put a USB keyboard on, but unfortunately, in order to do a US keyboard, you need to implement USB host mode, which is a little more difficult than implementing the PS2 protocol. Okay, so there are 2 joystick ports installed. The only thing left to do is insert the IC. So again, on the unit, um, regardless of which unit you're working on, the CPU is this. It's an ATmega 162. It'll be already programmed. It goes in the bottom unit right here.
Ouch, the solder is hot.
And then the other chip that's necessary is a cross-point switch.
I personally like the PS/2 keyboards over the USB ones, but sadly getting harder to find new ones now.
That's true, definitely true. So this is a Mitel 8812 cross-point switch, which is really the magic that makes this keyboard work. So it's basically an entire keyboard matrix in a chip. And there it goes. So that's the one. And here's the other. This is for 64. Same chip, same location.
Done yet? Grinning
Almost.
face.
There we go. And there we go. That's make sure you didn't bend any pins. The only other things to comment for people that are putting other units together is on a 128D, you'll need or I'm sorry, on 128D, you'll need a way to get power. And so there'll be a piece of wire in the kit that you need to solder here, and then there'll be a cassette connector that also in the kit. You'll solder the other end to the to the cassette connector and plug it into the cassette port. That's only needed for the 128D. The other ones, the SX 64 and internal 128 ones, you can get power from inside. You don't need to pull it from the cassette port. Or in the case of 64 and the SX64, power comes in on the keyboard. I think it comes on the keyboard in 128 as well, but not 128D, if I remember correctly. So there we go. I have everything on this one and everything on that one. So there we go. 2 units finished, ready to ship out. Hopefully you got yours put together. If not, send me an email. Talk to everybody later.